All right. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Serious Angler podcast powered by our friends over at X2 Power Batteries. As always, I'm your host, Bailey Egbrett, and joined with me, feeling much better than
Finally.
he has been, is the captain, Mr. Andy Full. What's going on, buddy?
I am. It's been a rough month over here in the Full household. Like, Amanda's still slightly sick. I finally got back to guiding the last 2 days, and I got the dry cough kind of happening again. I'm just like, I might have to sleep another 3 days before I get like pneumonia again. So we'll see. We're trying though. Like, what's going on with you?
Not much, man. We're just grinding away. We got a lot of exciting stuff coming for this show, but I feel like we say that a lot. It's been a lot of background work. It's been a lot of, I mean, our guest tonight knows what it's like being in the trenches of things, and that's kind of like, it sounds bad when we say that, but like from a media platform, it's a lot of background work to make things look good on the front end. And I'm not saying we look good because we got two ugly mugs on a screen right now. We got to do
my computer screen's broken.
Yeah, it's as much background work as we can do to try to make things run smooth, make things happen, make things cool, make things not a pain for you guys listening and watching to attend to. And with that, I'm happy to say within probably, you would say what, Andy, within the month, we will have our website up and running. And with that, we'll have a bunch of apparel for you guys to find. We've been getting a bunch of questions about it. Like, when is this going to be available? What are we going to be able to get? It's going to be up for you guys. Hoodies, sweatshirts.
Bailey's working hard, really hard at getting this up and running for you guys. So everyone should give him a round of applause for the valiant effort he is putting in, because he is the man.
Well, it's like, it's been 3 years. We've done like small pre-orders, and I hate shipping stuff. So like, this was a lot of like background headache to get it set up, but we have it set up. We just have a couple more steps to make sure we're doing it right. That way you guys don't have headache when you go to buy stuff and go purchase apparel. And we're going to have some cool stuff with that apparel. We're going to have some fun things like with Series Dangler. We're going to have some fun shirts. But we're also going to do some theme shirts throughout the year that we're brainstorming internally, that can be like some shirts that'll be themed towards, Veterans Day or Memorial Day, that all the proceeds go to veterans and first responders. Some stuff like that. We're going to try to do some good with this platform, because when you get a following, it's always good to give back. We got a bunch of people joining in. We're going to get our guest down here in a second. And Andy and I are very, very excited to get our guest down. I met him probably a month ago or so, maybe a month and a half, back down in Louisiana. It was in New Orleans for an ASA summit. And we got to talking, and this guy's knowledge of fish biology intrigues me. I could have talked to him for days on end, but this will be probably the first of many episodes. We're going to get Mr. Stephen Bardin on the show to talk about a whole list of topics. We're going to bring him on here in a second. But two more things I have for you guys is, with the new website, what we're also going to do is we are creating a newsletter for you guys that'll come out once a week. If you want to get that newsletter, what that newsletter will show is what that week's going to look like in terms of episodes. You'll get the sneak peek of who's coming on, what to expect. We'll have like discounts on apparel. We'll have a bunch of different sneaky deals, discounts from our partners and such that'll be on that newsletter. If you want to get on that newsletter, either reach out on social to either Andy or I, or the Serious Angler social, or our email is actually in the show description. If you guys want to get on that, just email us. We'll add you to that email list, and we'll get you squared away. That should be up and running in a few weeks. And then if you did not take advantage of the Black Friday deals, one thing I want to remind everybody is every single show throughout the entirety of the year, all of our show partners that provide you guys, the fans of Serious Angler, a discount code is in that show description. So if you guys want to get a percentage off of Hobie Eyewear or tackle at Omnia Fishing, all that jazz, everything is down below for you guys to take advantage of. Andy, anything I'm missing before we get our guest on tonight?
Oh, we just hope everyone loaded up on all the awesome Black Friday deals that were going on out there.
I know DeWitt was running a lot of sick stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So, I took advantage of it myself.
Oh, didn't we all? Like, I hope all of our listeners did as well. But like, I'm I'm sure I'll be yelled at when all the packages start rolling in.
Sounds like Black Friday.
Oh yeah, like
Yeah,
every day we have Amazon packages showing up on the doorstep right now, and I'm just like, what the heck is this?
that's right. Well,
Ugh.
Andy, our guest tonight, we're going to bring him on here in a couple seconds. He is heading the Major League Fishing's habitat restoration project, something that I got tied in for my work. And this is how I actually got to know Steve. We had a mutual connection here, but it's cool to have some beers and talk some fishing down with him in Louisiana. But I'm excited to bring him on right here, Mr. Stephen Bardin. What's going on, man?
Hey guys, how are y'all tonight?
Good
Doing
man.
good.
How are you?
We're doing
Yeah, I'm enjoying my Texas weather. 75 degrees today. It was a great day to be out on the boat. Cold front comes through tonight, so tomorrow will be maybe 40.
This is probably like the time to be in Texas where it's not like blistering hot.
It's not blistering hot, and November fishing is typically pretty good. It can be rough because it's Florida bass, so if they get stained water, high water, stuff like that, they get temperamental. Cold fronts, they're temperamental, but man, they're chomping. They are just chomping. So it's a good time. With what I do most of my fishing while everybody else is in a tree stand. So from here through January, I'll be fishing as much as possible.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. I wish I could be bass fishing right now.
Yeah.
We could be bass fishing, but the 45-mile-an-hour winds every day kind of keep us from doing that, unfortunately.
Yes.
But Steve, really fast before we kind of dive into the thicket of today's show, kind of give the folks a little bit of background about you, what you do, and then kind of your introduction into fishing itself.
Perfect. I can do that. So my name's Stephen Bardin. I'm a fisheries biologist. I got a bachelor's degree from a local university called Tarleton State. And that's in the Texas A&M system. And my bachelor's degree was in freshwater biology. And shortly thereafter, I went and got my master's at Texas A&M. And while I was at A&M getting my master's in fishery science, I decided to start my own lake management company. So I own a lake management company. It's private water only, and it's called Texas Pro Lake Management. We work on private waters, creating trophy bass fisheries for our clients, mainly absentee owners. Throughout my career, I've done a lot of stuff, Bailey. I was a adjunct professor for Tarleton State for 5 years, taught fisheries management and conservation. Also taught a course in ichthyology for 2 years. Ichthyology is the study of fishes, kind of their history and evolution. And then more recently, myself and my business partner, I'm business partners with Gary Klein. So everybody knows him. We started a business called Black Bass Stewardship Group, which puts together kind of his knowledge as an angler and my knowledge as a fisheries biologist and creates conservation projects for companies, brands, events. And, we represent Major League Fishing in their fisheries management division. And so me and you met, I would guess, in March at Red Crest was the first time. And we had just announced the Fisheries Management Division's partnership with Berkeley Labs. And then, of course, we spent a pretty cool week in Louisiana last month. So I'm glad to be on the show. Really anything, I guess I'm more of an ecologist than anything else. But anything fish related that you guys want to throw at me, that's freshwater, I can probably talk about.
Oh, it's perfect. And I know I threw a lot of it at you already when we were in New Orleans. And I really fast, for folks that are watching this live, feel free to let questions rip. Steve, actually, he said offline, we could put him on the spot. He gave us permission. So if you guys got questions, we're going to take a stab at them. So feel free to flood the comments.
I taught 20-year-old kids for 5 years. You guys can't throw a tough one at me.
That sounds like a challenge.
Yeah. Good thing I don't ask challenging questions. I'm pretty simple-minded over here.
Well, Steve, let's start hot and heavy here with a question that I've talked about. Well, one I've talked about with you, but also Andy and I have brought this up many times on this show. And it's good to finally have somebody that has like the knowledge to talk about this truthfully versus us just disgruntled anglers that are speaking our opinions, is spraying grass. Because one of the things we talked about, I expressed the way I felt about it with you, and leaving that conversation, I felt completely different about spraying grass because there's a lot of education around it. And there's some people that do it correctly, which of healthy for the fishery, as you discussed. But there's some people that don't do it right. But kind of explain the importances of spraying grass.
All right, we're gonna nerd out already. I'm so sorry to this audience. Let's start with why does grass grow, right? And we're talking about aquatic vegetation, and basically anywhere sunlight penetrates to the sediment, you could have some sort of aquatic vegetation grow, and we call that the littoral zone of a reservoir. So for most reservoirs, let's say with a 24-inch visibility, that littoral zone is going to be somewhere between 12 and 6 foot, depending on what's really causing that visibility. And that's where vegetation is going to start growing. And unfortunately, reservoirs were never built for actually fishing. They were built to impound water for a number of different reasons and prevent floods. So we didn't shape a reservoir whenever we started. So what you have is you have some areas that have a lot of littoral zone. You have some areas that have no littoral zone. Then you also have an unpredictable seed base of plants, and plants propagate in several different ways. I kind of chatted about hydrilla. It's one of the most popular plants for fishing around. And the cool part about hydrilla is it'll propagate 4 different ways. So it has tubers, and tubers are like a little potato. And then it has turions, which is kind of like a little pine cone. And then it will also do what's called fragment. So if a piece of hydrilla breaks off, it starts a new plant. And then finally, it'll have seeds if it's a sexually reproducing plant. So you can have a plant like hydrilla actually grows with 1% sunlight, so a lot deeper than most of our native species. But a plant like hydrilla with lots of reproductive methods, it's going to grow and it's going to take over that littoral zone. Now, the cool part is in a fishery, if you have the right amount of littoral zone, that creates great nursery habitat. It creates defined edges that you can fish around, and it's angler friendly. The issue we have is if we have too much littoral zone or the wrong plant growing in the wrong environment, it wasn't shaped correctly. So I don't want to just keep going on and on about plants. But whenever you spray a plant, the interesting part is a herbicide selection. There's 2 different types of modes of action. So you have systemic herbicides or you have contact herbicides. And if I were to go to any reservoir, I would look at what plant it was, and then I would select a systemic herbicide if I wanted to eradicate it, or a contact herbicide if I wanted to do something more like manicure it, if I wanted to spray it and get it out of small areas. Now, the herbicide, a contact herbicide, has to physically touch the plant. So you don't really spray it. That's not the correct term. You would inject it. You would drive over the top and you would put the herbicide right over the top of the plant, and it would coat and just kill the plant where it touches it. A systemic herbicide has to sit in the water for several days or months, and has to have a parts per billion of that chemical active to absorb into the plant. And then there's a mode of action. So it would stop something like photosynthesis from occurring within the plant. That's what would actually kill the plant, is its inability to do photosynthesis. So I feel like we're nerding out way too much already. This is just the first question.
Great, buddy. Like let it rip. But if you feel like there is like a term that is like takes a sense of expertise to understand, like from your degree, like feel free to stop and explain it really fast. For us, Andy and I are like Andy said, we're simple folks, so some big words might fly over our
Mine
heads.
is bass eat grass works. Let's catch fish. Like that's where my brain works.
So if we take it to like small impoundment management, that would be maybe easier. So if we had a 10-acre lake, and the 10-acre lake that's brand new, and we constructed ourselves, we would want to construct it with 20% or less of that lake in littoral zone. So that would initially, we would only have 20% of that lake that could possibly grow vegetation. And if I stay at 20% or less, what that does is that maximizes the ability for juvenile fish to escape predation and still have a fertile lake that will produce forage. And I would actually have my maximum carrying capacity somewhere between 15 and 20% of the lake having littoral vegetation. Anything over 20% becomes an issue, especially as you get closer to 30%. Once we get to 30%, largemouth become super lethargic predators, and their home ranges shrink, so they don't move as often. They don't consume as much forage. The forage has to come to them. And so what we see is whenever a small impoundment has 30% or more littoral zone, your growth rates slow down. So your carrying capacity isn't reached as easily. You can take this on a much larger scale. It's the exact same thing. Every reservoir has a carrying capacity. But instead of talking about 30% of the reservoir, you would talk about 30% of an area within a reservoir. So if we were taking like Okeechobee, we're not going to say, well, 30% of the lake can't have vegetation. What we would say is like this area, if it gets beyond 30%, that's going to cause those fish to have smaller home ranges, become more lethargic, and weigh less. If we could get that down to 15 or 20%, what would end up happening is there would be more forage available to them. They'd have a larger home range. They'd be easier to catch.
So essentially, to take it out of nerd word context, right? Like the smaller the vegetation field we have, the less target area these bass have to feed, but there's still sustainable area for forage to live, basically is what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's always species dependent. There's certain species that just how they grow. Let's take like a bushy pondweed. A bushy pondweed is going to grow just like what its name sounds, like a little bush, a dense bush. It's going to grow in super shallow water, but it's going to be very hard to penetrate with a lure. So you're going to fish the edges of it. That means that the largemouth are going to live on the edges of it. They can't go inside it either. There's not one of these fish that has a weed eater with them when they're going in and out of vegetation. Like they've got to go through the tunnels and channels that are made naturally how that plant grows. And that's why plants like hydrilla that have more of a stem with branches on it and very small leaves create canopy and create those canals, and people like to do things like punch into those vegetations or fish the tops of them because of how their growth pattern goes. There's other plants that I think of like an eelgrass. Like an eelgrass creates like a meadow or a field, and depending on current, that plant is really fishable or it's actually really difficult to fish. If the current has it laying over, it creates a great canopy and it creates an edge. But if the current stops and it becomes stagnant, that leaf floats to top and will hang every bait you throw through it.
That's super intriguing. And one of the things you had mentioned to me, and I'd love for you to explain this further, was with grass. Like if you have too much grass in a fishery, it's hard to build bigger bass, I believe is what I understood from you. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so that goes back to what I was saying about the 30% and the carrying capacity.
Right.
And it really, we think of vegetation as like nursery habitat and places that we can go catch fish. But on an ecological level, your vegetation, any aquatic vegetation, is competing for nutrient during the day with phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is what gives water that green color. If you go out to the lake, we see green water. That's phytoplankton. That's a microscopic plant. The majority of oxygen in the lake come from that phytoplankton. And the majority of fish, almost all the fish in the lake, start their food chain by eating phytoplankton, or they definitely consume another plankton that consumes phytoplankton. So we have phytoplankton, zooplankton, and then we have like macroinvertebrates like copepods. That's the food chain. Okay, that's the food chain for every juvenile fish and for things like shad. Aquatic vegetation is larger, and so it has more surface area to grab nutrient and absorb nutrient than small phytoplankton. So it's more efficient. So as you increase to 30% of the reservoir in vegetation, what that does, it creates water clarity. So if the littoral zone was originally at 8 foot, as that plant absorbs nutrient and starves out the phytoplankton, it creates water clarity that allows the plant to continue to grow because now sunlight can penetrate further. So now it can grow to 12 foot or 15 feet. And whenever that starts to happen, our carrying capacity goes down because the food source for juvenile fish is going away, and because now we've increased beyond 30% to 40 or 50%. So it becomes much more difficult for those largemouth to grow. So if I'm growing trophy fish, once again, I'll go to like small impoundments. If I'm going to grow trophy fish in a 20-acre lake, I want 15 to 20% to be littoral zone. I want 2 to 3 foot of visibility, a rich green phytoplankton color, because that starts the food chain correctly and it provides habitat.
It's super intriguing to me. Like, I feel like, I mean, we have some people already saying in the chat how they need you to come to their specific state to help certain things.
Yeah.
But we have an interesting question here from Adam S.
Okay.
He's asking, without spraying, what could be some alternatives in limiting excessive aquatic plant growth in a lake?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam. I'm gonna caveat the whole night with every fishery is different. You know, you have a different situation, you have a different nutrient level, you have a different topography, you have different plant species, and then environmental conditions, including weather and temperature. So it's hard to blanket statement anything. I was actually talking to Bill Shedd from AFCO, and one of the things he told me was it is so hard to get into fisheries conservation on the freshwater side because all of our issues are regional or local. Where whenever AFCO was originally starting, all of their issues that they were looking for in coastal fisheries were all universal. So, Adam, the question is going to be difficult to answer, but at the same time, I think I can give you a broad enough answer that it's okay. So, in fisheries management, we teach integrated pest management for controlling plants. And so, what integrated pest management means, use every resource available and make herbicides your last option. Okay. So usually it feels like it's the opposite. It feels like it's like go straight for spraying, but we try to use integrated pest management. And we put control methods into three categories. The first one is mechanical control. Mechanical control would be anything that physically removes plant. And this is really good if your plant does not reproduce through fragmentation. So almost all your submerged plants will. Eelgrass, coontail, hydrilla, they will all reproduce through fragmentation. So if I were to go and physically remove them with a rake or a large piece of equipment or tractor, what would end up happening is every piece of fragment that I left would reroot and create new plant. So I might be cleaning that plant out today, but I'm creating new plant for tomorrow, and that could become an issue. It will also allow it to move quite a bit within the reservoir. So mechanical can be this really cool, quick removal of plant as long as it doesn't fragment. The next one we have, is any biologic control. Biologic controls are what you've heard of, like triploid grass carp. And the hard part about using a biologic control is you can't control where that fish eats or what it eats. So to me, in my private company, biologic control is actually one of our least used applications because it's an eradication method. It's not a control of a plant. You do have a little bit of work being done on minimizing that littoral zone using some sort of shade or dye, especially in small fisheries, or fertilization can do the same thing, increasing that phytoplankton bloom to shade the bottom, and that will work a little bit. So then we always end up right back to spraying. And so you look at the plant, if it doesn't fragment, you may be able to mechanically control it. You will have, the sad part about any mechanical control is you're going to have a lot of loss of fish whenever you do it. Any fish that lives in that environment is going to get removed, and you could have some off-target species being removed too. If you select the right herbicide, you can be very species specific. I mean, at this point, I've posted on my social media about 4 or 5 years ago a herbicide job that I did, a private in Texas. If you have a dock on a reservoir, in a lot of our reservoirs, you can get a permit to spray around your dock. And this reservoir allowed 10 foot around the dock, and somebody contracted me to come do it. And there was lily pads next to hydrilla, and they wanted to remove the hydrilla and leave the lily pads. And after 10 days, you could see a definitive line that I drew around the lily pads to leave them. And I got rid of all the hydrilla, but left the lily pads. And that can be done. It just takes a lot of extra time and effort to make sure that you don't overspray and you select the right chemical.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting things I took away from our conversation was picking the right herbicide for the fishery. because I had explained to you one of our home lakes, Cayuga, one that MLF went to last year, is going again this year. I think they selected the wrong one to use because they didn't realize, hey, there's natural wind current on this lake, and because they had used pellets, and that's why the north end of the lake has no grass in it. So that was one of the conversations we had that was super intriguing. And I feel like this one in particular, from talking about grass, I mean, Andy knows I like go on about it for hours, but like in the 10 minutes talking to you about it and tonight, I've learned life like way more than I already could have anticipated. But I think this is one that's super interesting. And you made a good point about like this is super specific to where you live, because obviously these things can change. But I was going to ask this later on in the episode once we gotten through some different topics, but I think it's good to preface throughout it is like if people have issues or they think they have issues with in their region or their local lakes. Obviously, you have local fisheries and game, but sometimes they can be very difficult to communicate with. What would you suggest is a great way to communicate with your, whether it's local, regional, or state fishing game, of how to try to get a conversation going about local issues?
Yeah, that's great. So this kind of goes into my MLF hat and my Black Bass Stewardship Group hat. I wear a ton of different hats. So I deal with every biologist across every state throughout the year. You know, MLF, we do a lot of data sharing and we do projects across several states. And you're right. I mean, some of the biologists are super easy to get a hold of and communication's great. Others, you know, it's difficult because they're so busy. You know, these guys and gals have, I laugh all the time because I work in the private sector where like I've got one person to make happy, and as long as I make them happy, I'm good. Where state biologists, they literally have hundreds of thousands of stakeholders that kind of determine, you know, are they doing a good job at their job? And there's no real way to win because everybody has a unique perspective on what they want the reservoir to look like, or you know, whatever it may be. But if I was going to try to communicate, the first thing I would do, I would go to the website for whatever my state agency is, and I would look up my regional biologist, who is the actual biologist that is going to be taking care of my fishery. And I would send them the first email or just call their office directly. It is much easier to communicate with them if you're asking questions rather than demanding answers. So being polite goes a long way with these state guys. But, you know, they do work for you. And what I mean by that is you have a lot of resources at your fingertips. Number one, anything that the state agency spends money on or does in a public reservoir is an open record. So you can get a record on every single thing that is done within that reservoir if you need it. The hard part is you have to be able to understand it's written in a scientific language. So if you get a record of a report or something like that, you have to be able to read it, understand it, to know what's exactly happening. You know, the things that we get a lot of questions, of course, about spraying. We get a lot of questions about stocking largemouth bass fingerlings across the country. And, you know, most fisheries don't need those things done, and it takes reading into the reports to figure out why that is. The other thing that I would tell everybody, Bailey, is at least once a year, if not multiple times a year, you have the opportunity to provide public comments on any regulation change that's occurring. And then whenever you have any of your, like I'm part of the, you know, Texas Freshwater Fisheries Advisory Committee. And the committee, you know, meets and we discuss what our recommendations for Texas Parks and Wildlife are for any new regulation change. After we put our comments in, then it becomes open for all people. And whenever I do a comment, let's say like we had one about tilapia, they were going to change the regulations by stocking tilapia in private lakes 2 years ago. And we get dozens of open comments, and that should be hundreds, if not thousands of open comments. So, you know, participating in that section of your agency commission, and like I said, it happens at least once, if not twice a year, to where you can go to the state office, you can select your time, you can get your 10 minutes, and you can stand up and say exactly what you want and put it into a public record, or you can submit those comments online if you can't be there that day, and they'll be read out loud. And that's really a benefit to everybody that isn't used enough.
Yeah, and that's one thing I thought has been interesting, and that's I'm glad you said that, because that's one thing I've actually acknowledged too, as well as the participations. I think the amount of folks that acknowledge certain issues are there, and I think there's a solution to an extent, like dependent on the state of like you're talking about having the personnel having these open sessions to ask questions. I think one of the issues there is that I think to an extent the departments, like say I'll take New York for an example, they use these very traditional and outdated ways of communicating that they're going to have these open sessions, whereas everybody now is on like email or social media when they get their information, where I think it's just the message isn't reaching because of their way of trying to communicate. Yeah, and I think that's really it. That could be as easy as just bringing in somebody that's, you know, more up to modern time of trying to communicate such, which I think could be an easy thing to change if that's like an issue that's not just in New York. But that's something I think people need to take advantage of if they have the opportunity and know it's there. Whether it's showing up in person or, like you mentioned, sending emails, because I mean, our buddy on the show has his own podcast, Alex Rudd. He's mentioned how he either writes letters or emails to their Tennessee fishing game. And they are very communicative in terms of getting back to them, or like they don't have an answer. Like they're like, we acknowledge your statement question. We will get back to you on this. And they actually do get back. So it seems like certain states are really good at this communication, but I think some could use some work, and I don't think it's their fault. It's just their methods.
I mean, all of them are improving. 10 years ago, it was much more difficult. And like you're saying, a lot of the technology usage is increased. If you go even like Arkansas is the prime example. If you right now live in Arkansas and you want to know about your fisheries, every district within Arkansas has a month or a weekly newsletter that goes to your email that tells you everything that's going on. I got one today about a reservoir called Greer's Ferry in Arkansas, and they were talking about the threadfin shad in Greer's Ferry. I mean, who's even heard of it? But I signed up for all of them, of course. But yeah, a lot of the states are going to those things. Of course, if you just get on the website, there's a public notice about the legislative session. So, you can see these things when the meetings are going to be. And like you say, Bailey, it does take effort on both parts, right? Like they've got to publish them in places that you can see them, but you got to go look for them.
Yeah. So to get back to like talking about this biology, conservation efforts, etc. Right. One of the points you made earlier of introducing new species to try to regulate another issue, and how that could be it could go one of two ways. And typically most of the time it's been done, it doesn't go the right way it's intended. Sometimes it's intended one way and it actually comes out better. And sometimes that we've seen it's come out way worse. But what are obviously you stated the reasons, but what are some like big hazards and detriments of trying to introduce a certain bait fish or certain species to try to regulate something else? Because I don't think there's been many case studies of it being effective.
Yeah, and it's that is less common today than it was in like 1980. There was a lot, kind of the golden age of the 70s and 80s, where it was like, let's just experiment, let's see what we can do. I mean, I was laughing because in the 70s and 80s, I mean, Texas was stocking peacock bass and trying to get them established. I mean, it was the Wild West. And there's still species like grass carp that are utilized, and most states now use triploid grass carp, which means they have 3 sets of chromosomes. They are sterile fish. They cannot produce viable eggs or milt. So they're sterile fish. So there's some things that were learned in the 80s and 90s that are now being used. And The hard part is, you have to decide, is the control method worth the risk of what's occurring? And in most situations now, it is not. Fisheries management, unfortunately, has moved towards more environmental management, as in, our agency folks are spending a lot of time on water quality, habitat, and a lot less time on stocking new fish and trying new things. It's more of, we figured out what works, we're going to stick to it, and we're not going to have any issues. The other problem is our reservoirs are kind of aging at the same rate throughout the country. And so I always try to make the point that, like, yeah, the 70s and 80s, reservoirs were brand new and we could try new things. And now we're seeing through the aging process that all of our reservoirs are becoming habitat limited. They're either becoming super nutrient rich or nutrient poor. They're becoming very silted in, and that all depends on what's happening within the watershed. But it's creating, now where our fisheries managers are having to react to the 70s, 80s management, as well as just the age of the reservoir. And so they're tasked with much more difficult and widespread issues, such as habitat loss or even like blue-green algae. And then we have, unfortunately, some invasive species, especially like that Tennessee River area. You've got the Asian carp species. They're knocking on the door of the Great Lakes any day. So there's some real issues that we have to address, and none of them are by stocking at other fish. I mean, that's just not going to happen.
I did see something. I think it was It was on YouTube, actually, because I was looking at the specific issue. I got thought, and of course nerded out, and it went on an hour of just tangent of Google search and YouTube. But there was a video of, I can't remember the location up north, but you're talking about getting this Asian carp knocking on the door of the Great Lakes. And there is a specific lock that I can't remember the location. You might know it.
Is it Chicago?
Where they have like this, basically, essentially an electric fence underwater.
Yeah. Illinois River. I believe it's in Chicago, Lake Michigan.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
you're right.
What's the proof of that? Like, in terms of, is that the fail safe for like not allowing these carp to, like, if that fails, are these carp going to get into the Great Lakes?
No, not necessarily, but it does. It's kind of the last prevention method that you have right there. And then, the other thing that's being done a lot is DNA water sampling, to where the technology with DNA is increasing so quickly that now we can take a drop of water and tell you what fish live in that environment. And so, it's basically the acoustic barriers and electric barriers are just buying time to where technology can get us to better management practices or monitoring practices. The unfortunate part with the Asian carps, the problem didn't start in 2020. The problem started in 1980. Those fish escaped fish farms. Those fish were brought into the United States for specific reasons, and they've escaped. And then, through time monitoring populations, they've migrated very quickly. And it's a cyclic thing. You're going to have places like Kentucky Lake that they really went through a tough time with Asian carp, and now it's self-limiting. And you go back to carrying capacity and things like that. It's self-limiting a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that the electric barrier is kind of one of those last hopes to keep those fish out of the Great Lakes.
Yeah, I don't even want to, like, the idea of getting that notice of like, hey, Asian carp are now in the Great Lakes would just kind of petrifies me. The thought of that.
And that's the thing, though. Like, I'm pretty sure they found a few in the Great Lakes, but they've been the triploid ones because they've escaped from like fish farms and floods that get into streams and they wash in the lakes. But I'm pretty sure that they've actually found like biomass of them in like the DNA water sampling. They just haven't found them actually in the lakes yet for whatever reason. But I have read a couple papers where they've had biomass of them. They just don't know if it's the triploids from like farm ponds and stuff that wash in the streams, or if it's actually like the silver and buffalo carp.
It's intriguing. We have a question here. You brought up the TVA. I said, with natural nutrient deposits starting to deplete in older impoundments like the TVA, is there a way to supplement nutrients into these impoundments?
Yeah. I mean, you can use agricultural fertilizer. We do it a lot in small impoundment management. There's a risk there, of course, because you're adding nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and things like that into the water. And it's got a cost to it. You also have almost everything that you do within a reservoir is reactive to whatever's happening on the watershed. So a lot of nutrient issues start on land, not in water. And with urbanization and things like that, we're really changing the culture of how land is used, moving away from farmland that maybe was non-grazed to farmland that's highly developed, and now to urban concrete that just pours water off of it and it carries whatever it carries in it. So a lot of how do we address nutrient issues starts in watershed, and how do we use the land around it. But there are fertilizers, there are nutrients that could be added to a system. It's just going to flow through awful quick through a TVA system.
We have another one here from Andrew Watson.
Okay.
That asks, how do daily changes in water level and flow direction in river reservoirs affect bass behavior?
That's a great question. So situational, right? Like this is the toughest part. And also it depends on species. Depending on which biologist you talk to, there's anywhere from 5 black bass species up to 19. So whenever you divide smallmouth into 1 species or 3 species, it gets confusing. But if we're talking about just change of water level, a fish has a home range. Largemouth have home ranges built on geographic markers. So physical things that they can see that are built in within their home range. And they're going to use those throughout the day. And if it's a predictable water level change or flow change, they're going to know how to use those geographic markers in that home range to still select and capture forage correctly. Your job as an angler is to figure out exactly what is that next habitat that fish would use and how big is that home range to maximize how many you're going to catch. Now, smallmouth and spotted bass, they're more nomadic species. They don't really use geographic markers as often. They use a lot more contour and bottom composition. And so, but it's going to be very similar, as in those fish do the same things throughout the day. They don't randomly show up on a place. So predicting, is this water level change something that's predictable annually, daily, whatever it is, if it's tidal, and then is that direction always the same or does it change? That would help kind of answer that bass behavior question, but it's going to be predictable every day.
That's some really good knowledge. I remember we don't have to dive into here, but we've had shows on where we've talked about like these reservoirs, like a TVA, for example, that can fluctuate, based on whatever the TVA is feeling like doing with that body of water that day, and how that can affect spawns. Like if fish come up to spawn and they drop the water, how that can be a detriment for that year. That's an interesting conversation. I think that one that could literally almost be a whole episode within itself.
Well, if you think about fish spawning, a male builds the nest. We all know that, right? The male builds the nest. That could take up to a week. A female, she comes and deposits part of her eggs in that nest, and then she leaves. That'll take a day or maybe several hours. And then that male's going to guard the egg. And depending on water temperature, that egg could stay an egg for 48 hours up to 10 days. And so, if you have warm enough water temperature, it would have to drop very quickly for this whole process to occur within, let's say, 7 days. Now you have colder water temperature, and now you've got a window that's like 14 to 18 days of build the nests, put the eggs in, guard the eggs. Once the eggs are free swimming, they hatch anywhere from 2 to 10 days. They're going to start being free swimming like 2 more days later. So, you could have a pair get to a bed, and then have those fry leave that bed within 4 days if temperature was correct. So that water fluctuation isn't as impactful as something that would take 18 days. That would be more difficult. And then you have other species like crappie. I don't know how many of y'all's fans are crappie fishermen, but crappie are one of my favorite species to manage. But they will literally just go to the shore if the water drops or a cold front comes in. They will leave and they just won't even spawn this year. They'll just be done and they'll reabsorb their eggs and call it a year. Where largemouth, they'll take another attempt in a couple of weeks if they need to. And it's a misnomer. A female largemouth typically spawns with 2 to 5 males. She doesn't just spawn with one. So she'll drop part of her eggs and then leave, find another male spawn. And so she it's kind of like an evolutionary process to where it's better to spawn over a wider window so that you have fry being produced in optimal conditions with a number of males so that you have the strongest fry possible. So evolutionarily, female largemouth have evolved to not put themselves in a situation where water level, temperature, a weak male, any of that would affect the survival of their offspring.
Oh man, my mind is blown right now. Yeah.
So cool.
Now I have a question because Bailey and I live up here in Buffalo, and we live on Lake Erie, one of the best smallmouth fisheries, one of the best and most underrated smallmouth fisheries, right, out of Buffalo, New York. So do smallmouth basically have the same spawn window? Like they can make a nest, drop eggs, and have fry within 4 to 8 days, but also do smallmouth have the same spawning tendencies where the big females will hop from nest to nest and lay them in different areas?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So whenever you think about a big female has larger eggs and fewer of them than a small female. A small female will have more eggs per pound of body weight, but they'll be smaller. So a big fish, it would have the advantage of putting those eggs out early, and then those fry hatching and being larger than the smaller fishes fry. So, as fish increase in size, they will spawn earlier and earlier within the year. And then they will spread their eggs out a little bit longer to make sure that they get viable offspring. But yeah, they'll do multiple spawns. What you don't see typically it lasting 3 months. What you see is, a largemouth or a smallmouth going to a nest, selecting a nest, dropping eggs. Once they're covered, she will move off, and she may recover for a day or two and then find another nest. And that first spawn is usually about 50% of the eggs, and then it kind of subsequently reduces by 50% every time to where, the last spawn, there's really very few eggs.
That is super cool. I mean, just the note of 2 to 5 different male. That blew my mind. Strong, independent women we have in these lakes.
There you go.
Survival of the fittest, I guess.
Right. Okay, so we have a question here from Mr. Bradley Hallman, which, by the way, congrats to Brad. He qualified for the Bassmaster Elite Series this year. So congrats. We've had Brad on the show before, which we're long overdue to get him back on the show.
His second time on the Elite Series.
Right.
That's
right. He made it back. He's back. So he makes a sarcastic comment here, but I'm going to actually turn this into a legitimate question. He talks about, is live scope going to be the death of all bass species swimming in North America, which some people actually legitimately believe, as crazy as that sounds. But I want to rope that into a legitimate question of, we talked about a little bit with COVID. I mean, it's people have talked about it all over the place since COVID. Obviously participation has increased at an unprecedented number. And we saw the statistics at the summit that we were both at. So obviously participation is way up there. This technology is becoming more easily accessible, like a forward-facing sonar, like a live scope, and more people are having it on their boats. One of my questions is, from a forward-facing sonar, you hear some people say that I think these fish are dodging basically their sonar, like their forward-facing sonar, when they put it in the cone, these fish are running away from it, like they're feeling it. With enough
Right.
pressure on a lake, is it possible for these fish to feel that type of deal and be able to be that receptive of something like a forward-facing sonar to basically skirt that, if that makes sense?
Okay. The short answer to the question is, do bass feel things in their environment? And it's absolutely. The bass felt you coming from 100 yards away. It felt every component of your boat down its lateral line. And there's a lot of research that shows, just circling a bass one time, 50% of those fish will swim away no matter what. So the truth is, your live scope is only making you aware of what's always happened in the past. Whenever you pull a boat up to an area, you move fish all the time. The forward-facing sonar is just showing you that. There's a lot of state agencies that are right now doing research into the vulnerability of fish, specifically crappie or large, offshore largemouth, to things like live sonar. And the majority of them are coming to the same conclusion, which is you have to be a damn good angler on the front of that boat to get that fish to react to bite. It's going to speed up the process of finding fish, but it's not going to make you able to catch more fish. You still have to be an angler that can do that. It's also, like you're saying, like you have to close that gap and get close enough to that fish to make it happen. So people that have the skill to not get on top of the fish are still advantageous over you at, the number of fish they catch. But no, I mean, the height of bass fishing in the United States happened in the 90s. We have less bass fishermen today than we did in the 90s. Now they're more skilled as a population. COVID increased the number of fishing license sales, but not to a historic level of bass anglers, and definitely not to a historic level of consumptive anglers, people that are actually removing fish from a reservoir. That happened in the 70s. So, we've got to caveat these things in the fact that, yeah, there might be more bass boats sold right now. That's because it's the most popular, sport fish in America. And there may be more fishing license sold during COVID than there was in the previous 10 years. But that doesn't mean that necessarily those anglers are staying in the sport and competing, in tournaments and buying things like live sonar. You have to be a pretty skilled angler to maximize all of those pieces of components. And then I think that once again, we're learning what we've been doing for 20 or 30 years whenever we're fishing has actually been scaring fish. And the truth is that, whenever your granddad told you to be quiet in the boat, they can hear you. That was true. I mean, a fish has a lateral line. A lateral line on a fish is little holes that have hairs inside them, and it connects directly to the spinal cord. So that is designed to feel vibrations and changes within the water. So to think that a 20-foot bass boat running a trolling motor, and slamming that cooler and all those things isn't moving those fish, that's crazy. I mean, they can feel your crankbait, from 100 feet away. I mean, they can feel it.
So I guess my question off of this is then, I read a report probably like 8 months to a year ago about Connecticut, which is a state up here in the Northeast, as we all know. They're actually looking at putting in regulations for restricting bass tournament creel limits because of forward-facing sonar. Do you think that's something that a lot of states are going to try to do and implement?
Yeah, probably. I would think so. What we have to realize about a traditional 5-fish tournament is that we are culling fish throughout the day, and we're selecting exceptional individuals out of that population. And then we're bringing them still to a weigh-in. And the unfortunate truth is there is delayed mortality. And depending on whose study you want to read, that's anywhere from 50% up to 90%. And a lot of state agencies consider, whenever they write that permit and they know how many boats are going out, they consider that a 5-fish limit where all the fish are gonna die. That's just the truth of it, because we don't have a consumptive population anymore. We don't have people that are consuming edible size fish, and instead our biggest non-natural mortality does come from these tournament anglers who are trying their best. They're doing everything they can, and they've got the best equipment possible, but we're culling fish. We're trying to catch the 5 biggest that we possibly can, and we're moving them to another location, and some of them are dying. So yes, a state like Connecticut would probably put in some sort of regulation on that, because it takes a long time to grow a trophy-sized fish in those northern climates. A state like Texas or maybe Florida, probably not. If they're going to do any restrictions, it's going to come in the summer whenever fish are stressed because of temperature, low oxygen, things like that.
That was my next question is, like, what is the preferred seasonality for fish survival in a 5-fish creel limit in a tournament?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of mortality that happens in a 5-fish or a live weigh-in event is because of time in the live well where ammonia increases and oxygen decreases. And that's going to happen more rapidly in the summer. In the summer months, as water temperatures increase, the potential to hold oxygen decreases in that water. Now, we think of oxygen, like for us, we breathe 20% oxygen. A fish is going to have mortality starting anything below 4 parts per thousand oxygen. So we're talking about a very small amount of oxygen anyways. So as we get towards summer, the potential for that water to hold that dissolved oxygen decreases. Therefore, the time in that live well becomes more dangerous. You also have, every time a fish breathes, kind of how the gill works, they take water in through their mouth. The water goes past the gill filament. The blood runs opposite through a gill filament. The blood's capturing oxygen out of the water, but it's releasing ammonia whenever it does it. So it's actually removing, kind of like if we're peeing, like the urea and the ammonia cycle, right? It's removing the nitrogen out of that fish's blood and putting it into the water at the same time it captures water. That's what the gill does. So whenever you put a fish in a live well and you set a timer, no matter what, your oxygen's going down and your ammonia is going up.
So in that case, what are the steps you can do as a tournament angler to help increase the survival rate of the bass on like a 90-degree day in August or a 120-degree day in August in Texas?
That's a great question, Andrew. Okay. First thing, you should put a little salt in your water. Salt is a natural antibiotic for fish. It makes them secrete slime, which protects the exterior of the fish. All freshwater fish are always looking for salt. So a little bit of salt, and we're talking, it's hard, but you're talking about like half of a cup for your 30-gallon live well. Okay. So put a little salt in there. Next thing is you can add ice to it, but you don't want to drop the temperature more than 5 degrees. If you drop the temperature more than 5 degrees, that's a thermal shock that causes a lot of other issues with the fish. So if the water temperature is 90 or above, what I would do is I would leave my pump running to where I'm putting in new water all the time. So I'm adding as much oxygen as possible. I'm going to add ice periodically, not all at once. I'm not going to take a 40-pound bag and put it in the water. That will kill the fish.
So maybe like fill up some bottles and freeze it and kind of drop them in there and let it slowly.
Periodically, right. You want 5 degrees. That's what you want, 5 degrees. Now, a quick hint, if I'm in Texas and I'm fishing shallow water, there's a lot of vegetation, things like that, that water temperature in shallow is going to be warmer than deep water. So if you're really concerned about the health of the fish, you would take a short boat ride periodically as well and bring in some cooler water from deeper, and definitely watch the water input coming into your live well and make sure that you don't get any vegetation stuck on that input screen, because that will shut down all the water coming in. But adding new water continuously is going to be important. The next thing is have a little bit of hydrogen peroxide with you. Hydrogen peroxide immediately adds oxygen to water. It also heats water. So you don't add a lot. We're not talking about dumping a bottle in there. We're talking a couple cc's. It will increase the oxygen. It will de-stress the fish just a little bit, and that will save you if you get into a jam.
Now,
Yeah.
what kind of salt are we adding into the live well? We had a question here. Andrew
just
Watson asked iodized, but like,
yeah, any table salt is good to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
You just need salt. Yeah.
Yeah, Andy, that was something that when we had Mark Menendez on the show, as he was mentioning, because he has a biology background of adding that hydrogen peroxide, I believe is what you mentioned, to the live well.
Now, this is going to be awesome because I feel like all of our viewers who have bass boats are going to be sending us pictures of salt and the hydrogen peroxide in their boats. I'm like, this is awesome. If we can save a few fish's lives, the better.
Yeah, there's a lot of people nerding out, I think, right now that are watching this. So, something that was actually really cool that I picked up when you talk about the ice situation, when you talk about how it's way better to take when you don't take a 40-pound bag of ice and drop it in, obviously you're going to kill that fish. One thing I picked up from a good buddy of mine who is a full-time smallmouth guide in St. Lawrence River, especially with the summer smallmouth where you need to use ice, especially if you're fishing, 50, 60 foot of water. The temperature obviously is like big difference from the bottom to the surface when you're talking like July, August. His name's Dean Meckes. And one thing he showed me is he takes big like ice cream containers and fills them and freezes them and puts those in there because they melt slower. And he said that way you only put one in a day and it melts way slower than, say, a 40-pound bag of just small ice cubes that melt much faster. I thought that was super intriguing about from a melt rate standpoint. I know that's not like hard to dictate, but you see more guys. Dean did this. I put this on his story the other day. Is like there's certain things you can do now with your fish finders and live wells is have temperature gauges in there where you can continually monitor that, which is I think is super cool that people figure out.
Should be doing that. I mean, the hard part is if we're talking a 90-degree day and we're competing, 8 hours, we catch a fish at 7 a.m., we put it in the live well and we start reducing that temperature. And then at some point throughout the day, hopefully we're culling that fish. And if we're culling it at 2 o'clock, that new fish that we just caught is going into that cold water. And so you're going to have a temperature shock there. In really a temperature shock of 10 degrees on a fish is going to have a delayed mortality event. And so it looks good to us, but the stress that fish just went through, we'll never know. We won't see that necessarily. Now, a 20-degree temperature difference, and you're going to have a dead fish by weigh-in.
Holy crap. That's wild. Yeah. That's nuts. Okay, so Andy, do you have anything else on that before we keep rolling here?
Oh, let's keep rolling. Like I'm loving this. So
yeah. I had so my initial question about like this pressure with live scope, etc., that started this whole train of thought here. I had a part B, and that was with more boats that are being, you talked about having maybe less anglers, but we have more talent amongst anglers and being able to find these fish faster, be more effective. Does pressure on a fishery damage fish population, or do these fish populations, are they just adjusting to the pressure and behaving differently?
Yeah, the majority of fisheries, they're just adjusting. The majority of fisheries, we're not damaging because we're not consumptive, right? If we were going out and we were still taking, like whenever, the original Bassmaster stuff, we had 15 fish and we're going to fillet every one of them, that becomes an issue. You have evolved, and now that we've had 5 fish limit since, the mid 90s. And, that evolved because state agencies set a krill limit. And so that's what the tournament organizations could legally do. There's some state agencies that are at a 3 fish limit right now. There's others that are 6 or 10, so we still use 5 fish because now that's what we standardized towards. But, whenever we're talking about it, it's highly dependent on who's competing and how efficient they are at capturing those large fish and taking care of them. The good news is your live well is better than it's ever been. The good news is your fisheries agencies are better at assessing the fisheries and understanding permits and how many people should be competing and things like that. And they track mortality. Every time your fisheries agency goes and does a survey, they're tracking mortality. They're looking at how many fish are in each age class. So, I look at these reports all the time. They may have 12 years. They would have how many fish they catch, and they would then assess annually how many fish are naturally dying. And natural mortality is still much more higher than anything human caused whenever we're talking about tournaments. But they can assess that whenever we have things like, the tagged fish that some reservoirs will use. The fisheries agents are collecting that data to try to determine if that fish is a consumptive fish that somebody's catching and eating, if that fish is showing up in a tournament, or if that fish is never caught, and maybe it's natural mortality. But they're trying to define mortality using those studies. So I think that the answer to the question, Bailey, like, yes, we're better anglers. Yes, we have better technology. Yes, we have better survey methods in fishery science, and we're tracking things like we've never had before, where they're aging the fish, they're checking mortality annually, and they're coming up with real solutions on how many tournaments should we have a year.
Yeah, I actually heard, I don't want to say rumor, but I've heard through the grapevine that like the TVA or like the folks that oversee that waterway are looking into specifically that, like a Lake Chickamauga that has 14,000 boats on it every single day of the week, into like limiting the amount of tournaments that you can run on that fishery. That's something I think it's pretty cool, and I think that's something that is needed, especially from like a regional standpoint around the country. Like how many fish are being brought back to the scales, and you could argue about certain trails starting to pave a path for something like this, where maybe you don't need to bring 5 fish to the scales. Where like Andy, like from a smallmouth standpoint up here, a lot of the summer tournaments from the Great Lakes they run 3 fish limits.
Yeah,
Where something that's still competitive, but like at least you're eliminating the number from, not totally, but you're eliminating the total number of fish that are being, like you're talking about delayed mortality or just that are dying in the live well from trying to shove 5 big smallmouth into a live well when it's 90 degrees outside.
Well, there's other things like fizzing. I look at the catchway release format and I say one of the biggest accomplishments of the catchway release format is that you don't have to fizz fish. It takes a fish 5 minutes of atmospheric change to develop barotrauma, which is what is the inflation of the swim bladder. So if I were to catch a fish and bring it up, do whatever I'm going to do, weigh, measure, release that fish, and it goes back to the depth it was originally caught, within 5 minutes, that fish would not have barotrauma. So then that's a fish that we don't have to fizz. If we don't have to fizz a fish, we increase its survivability quite a bit.
So I have a question when it comes to fizzing smallmouth. Like I'm a smallmouth guide up here in Buffalo. It's what I do full time, and I almost refuse to fish summertime tournaments because of mortality rate with smallmouth. How important is it to use a different fizz needle with every single fish?
Yeah, so I wrote an article for Wired to Fish years ago talking about this. I personally would use a different needle every fish if possible. There's a couple reasons. Number one, a needle it's just like a hook, right? It's sharpened, but a needle's sharpened to have one penetration. If you ever watch your doctor or veterinarian, whenever they load an injectable into a syringe, they use one needle, they discard that needle. They put a new needle on to give you or your animal that vaccine. The reason is because you'll have micro bends in that needle. So you're creating a micro damage into that fish. But more importantly, you're taking the exterior and putting it inside. That means any bacterial transfer you're doing. And the more fish you take that from and put that into, the more times you have the likelihood to introduce bacteria into the swim bladder. The swim bladder is a closed organ. The reason they have barotrauma is because there's no communication between the oxygen absorption and the swim bladder, so they can't regulate it like that. Which means if you create bacteria within that over time, that's going to probably be pretty detrimental. So a new needle would be great, or a sterile needle would be okay as well.
So like to sterilize the needle, just basically like wipe it down with like an alcohol swab to like get any like bacteria off of it that you could and let it air dry? Like, how would you like?
No, I mean, Andrew, it would usually sterilization's done with heat and pressure, buddy.
That's what I figured. I just thought I would ask. So
yeah, I mean, that would be awesome if I could recommend that. But if I'm trying to be like a stickler, I would say, I mean, that's probably not going to be sterile. That's going to be better than nothing.
I feel like I'm back in health class right now.
Yeah,
are you saying that us anglers are the number one reason we're spreading smallmouth STDs? Is because we're using...
So I actually have another question though. When it comes to fizzing fish, is it better to fizz them through the side and like remove a scale, or go through between the crushers in the mouth?
It's better to go on the side.
Okay.
You have zero risk of ever penetrating another organ to get into the swim bladder through the side. If you go through the mouth, you do have the risk of penetrating another organ, because when the swim bladder inflates, it pushes things in how the cavity of those organs work. It's going to push them forward. There's a chance that you would go through the heart. That would be the worst one, of course, but there's several organs that you could go through before you get to the swim bladder if you go through the mouth. Now, if you want to talk about a virus, Bailey, and you guys want to nerd out a little bit, one of the things we did with the Major League Fishing Fish Management Division 2 years ago is we helped the state of Michigan do some research on largemouth bass virus being in smallmouth bass. And so when we were at St. Clair, have you guys ever caught a smallmouth that has like a red lesion on its side? Almost looks like a lamprey injury, but it's not a lamprey. You know it's not. It's like missing scales and it's kind of nasty. Yeah, so what we did was our MLF anglers during practice, they just counted how many fish were they catching with those lesions on their side. And then afterwards, on day one of competition, we assigned certain anglers to live well fish that had those lesions because we knew who was kind of catching them during practice. And they brought those fish back and we donated them to Michigan. And the state veterinary lab took those and isolated largemouth bass virus from that infection. And so Major League Fishing helped kind of collect these fish. It was a big cooperative effort from a lot of different tournaments and state agencies within Michigan. But we were able to isolate smallmouth bass virus or largemouth bass virus in a smallmouth. And the kind of sad part about that is, largemouth bass virus started kind of in the southern United States, and tournament angling was one of the number one spreaders of that virus. And so when you said like we as tournament fishermen are transferring this virus, unfortunately, we might be right. You think about COVID. We all had COVID on the mind for 3 years, felt like 3 years at least, but we all had it on the mind. And what we learned was whenever you're in a small confined space, you're more likely to catch a virus. Well, if we have a largemouth bass virus infected fish and we put a live well and we transport it to a weigh-in, and then we have a live release boat, that fish has the ability to be in a very small environment with several other fish and transfer that virus very quickly. So through the catch, weigh, release format, we were able to capture some fish, and Major League Fishing was able to help kind of show that this virus had switched from largemouth to smallmouth. And then this year, we actually have a grad student at Auburn that we're kind of replicating that kind of similar research, but we're doing it on Alabama bass and like the Coosa River chain.
That is wild.
Yeah, it's super cool. We're going almost an hour and 15 minutes here, and I feel like I have questions to go on for days. So I have one or two more I want to ask, and we might need to actually make this into a part 2 where we get you back on the show to keep asking some questions. But Andrew, do you have anything before I ask the last couple questions?
Man, I have an entire list of smallmouth questions, so like we're gonna have to have a part 2.
Yeah.
So like...
we're gonna have to we'll just schedule out the next show here, Steve. So people look forward to having more Steve on the show. I warned everybody when we started this that you're going to hear more of Steve after tonight.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I have is, and this one's more kind of simple, straight to the point, but what are the biggest keys to growing bigger fish in your fishery?
Okay. Number 1, genetics. Number 2, reducing competition. Number 3, forage. Number 4, water quality. And number 5, habitat. Those are the 5 keys.
Now you
It's
mentioned
that
one
simple.
there. Now, when you talk about competition, you mentioned removing competition. Does that include from one, like say a pike or a walleye, like stuff that competes with the bass for forage, or are you talking removing smaller bass, like especially if you have a large population of small bass? Is that the
both.
same? Both.
Both. You have a carrying capacity of predators, and let's make it easy. Let's say it's 100 pounds per acre. If I have 100 pounds per acre and I want to grow 10-pound bass, I can grow 10 of them per acre. That's it. That's the conversation. That's how simple it is. That's what I do on a daily basis. In private lake management here in Texas, Southern United States. It's very, very difficult to make it that simple in a public reservoir because you have so many different user groups, you have so many different species, and you have open systems. So you have new fish migrating in every day. In a reservoir that's closed, a closed system, it becomes much more easy. There's even, if we really want to get crazy about, small impoundment management, there's fisheries that we make that are all female largemouth bass. So there's no reproduction occurring. Whenever I was in grad school, I did my graduate research on creating sterile largemouth bass and crappie so that we could stock them at the exact number we want in the fishery and we could raise them to the size we want them and never have reproduction. We can do some Frankenstein stuff in the private sector.
That's so cool.
Now, I have... go ahead, Bailey. Sorry.
You're good.
I have a forage question. So up here in New York and the Finger Lakes, we had basically sister lakes, and they're two entirely different fisheries. One was like a trophy bass fishery for New York, so it was loaded with like 4 to 6 pound fish. But the difference between the lakes was that it had smaller, like bluegill, crappie, perch in it, and then you could go 15 miles down the road to the other lake, and it had an overabundance of small largemouth, but giant like bluegills, crappie, perch. So is there a correlation there? Like if you have a smaller baitfish forage population, does that help generate bigger fish as opposed to like having a stunted baitfish population? Does that help generate bigger fish than having a population with big forage in it and smaller bass?
Okay. So Andrew, your observation is correct in the fact that the fishery with the larger sunfish had smaller bass on average. That observation was correct, but how you got to it was the part that was kind of off. So what happens is you think about how often does a forage fish reproduce, right? Let's say a bluegill has 5 reproductions a year. So those offspring at some point compete with their parents for food. So the less offspring you have, because they're consumed by smaller bass that eat small forage, what that results in is more forage available for those original parents. Therefore, they grow larger. So it's kind of chicken before the egg there. On the trophy fishery, what you're seeing is a definitive line in the food chain where the forage fish can no longer grow above that because they're consumed. So as soon as they reach, let's say 5 inches, something is eating them. Where on the other side, there's no bass in the reservoir that can consume a 5-inch sunfish. So instead, they're consumed at 1 inch because that's what the bass can consume.
Got it. That makes complete sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have our last viewer question here, and I want to let the viewers know that I have been writing down a bunch of these questions you guys have asked, so they're not getting skipped over. We're gonna save them, and I have them written down to save for part 2. We bring Steve back. I don't want to force Steve to stay on here for 5-6 hours, which we could totally do, but I would not put him through that misery.
I've got a 5 a.m. wake up and drive to Athens, Texas to select our next Hall of Fame member for our Texas Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame, or I would have stayed on for 5 hours. My guys, if you want to hear about a tough time, whenever I taught fisheries management and conservation at Tarleton State, I still have my private lake management company, and they asked me to teach this course. And I said, I'll do it one day for 4 hours. And so you would show up to my class, and I had no notes. I had no book. You listened to me talk for 4 hours about whatever the subject was. and you just take notes as quick as you can.
That's awesome. I would have loved
Yeah,
to.
and then our final was an oral final where you had 5 minutes to teach me something you learned this year. If you didn't go 5 minutes, I got to ask all the questions I wanted until we got to 5 minutes.
Oh man, that's sick. You would have been the cool professor.
Yeah,
I
that
hate
was
written
pretty good.
exams. That would have been
Oh, me
perfect.
too. I didn't want to grade them.
Yeah,
So it's that oral. Is that we're going to talk this through.
That's awesome. All right, so last viewer question of the night. Then I have one more, and then we have one last fun question. We'll ask you, then we'll wrap this thing up here. It's from Chris Flay, and he asks, and I feel like a lot of people have asked this question, is why don't more states adopt the slot system like Texas does with Lake Fork?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the simplest answer, Chris, is going to be that whenever you have your state regulations, if they're standardized across the entire state, it's easier for you to comply. So it becomes much more difficult whenever we have special regulations, including slots that are fisheries based. Whenever we move to those, it becomes hard for users to apply, to comply with those regulations. And we think of things like bass anglers, right? We're watching a podcast right now about bass fishing. So we understand regulations. But for all those COVID anglers, for years that are just showing up, they don't really understand regulations. And so it becomes much more difficult to educate them than it is to just standardize the regulation. And then kind of the last part of that is you're going to see over the next 5 years, more states moving to what Oklahoma now does, which is allow you to basically remove as many fish as you want underneath a certain size and only possess one over a certain size. Because what we're seeing now is consumptive rates are so low for largemouth bass that a lot of fisheries are starting to have stunted populations. And so you're going to see some regulation change, but it's not going to be most likely a slot limit. It'll be more of what we would call a harvest limit, where they're kind of promoting you to actually take some small fish out.
It sounds like they're starting to like adopt some like saltwater, like redfish, snook regulations and stuff like that to help promote like a trophy fishery.
Yeah, we want trophy fisheries, but there's not many regulations that lead you to a trophy fishery.
Right.
Our state regs, our harvest regulations are kind of built to make it easy, not built to manage the fisheries as much as we would think. The management's done on the manager's side, basically. How are they manipulating forage? How are they manipulating stocking rates? How are they changing habitat? Things like that.
Makes sense. All right. So my last fisheries question to you, before we get into our last fun question that'll wrap it up for tonight, is what are the current trending, biggest, most important conservation efforts that people should be researching and getting behind?
Oh, that's a great question. All of our reservoirs are aging. Like I said that at the beginning of this process. Aging includes siltation. Aging includes nutrient changing, either nutrification or decreasing nutrient. And aging includes loss of habitat. And I think the number one thing that you're going to see your state agency and groups like Major League Fishing and Bassmaster asking you guys to volunteer for is going to be things like habitat restoration projects. Habitat restoration it's very popular right now because it's essential. If we want to talk about how do we grow more fish, how do we create trophy fisheries, how do we support more anglers, we got to have the habitat to do it. And we're not building new fisheries at a rate that kind of handles all these things. And all of our fisheries are aging at the same time. You really look at the curves, the up and down, the new lake effects that you see whenever our fisheries originally built and how great that population grows. I mean, I know that whenever me and you were talking in Louisiana, Bailey, I was showing you some pictures of things that we've grown, 3-pound largemouth in 1 year. You can do those in a new fishery. Most of your reservoirs now, due to a lack of habitat and maybe a lack of forage abundance, the fish are growing at like maybe half a pound, 6 inches a year, stuff like that. So habitat restoration is going to be one of those big topics. Another one is with nutrient and toxic algal blooms, things like blue-green algae. That's going to become more of a buzzword as we talk about climate change, as we talk about the fact that your summers are becoming more summerish, and kind of our winters are becoming more unstable. That's creating different nutrient flows that are leading to some harmful algal blooms. And then the last one, I guess, we have to talk about is exotic species. In the South, things like giant salvinia. Being aware of what those are and how to report them would be super important.
Cool. Well, that's really good to know. Okay. So our last question for the night, it's for everybody that's brand new to the show.
Okay. I'm brand new. Yeah.
That's right. And I'm sure we're gonna get you on a lot. I hope you're prepared, Steve.
I'm always prepared.
So if you could sit down and have a beer and a steak with 3 different individuals, they do not have to be the fishing industry. They could be sports. They could be whatever. They could be alive now or 1,000 years ago. It doesn't matter. Any 3 individuals that you'd like to sit down, have a steak, have a beer, pick their brain, who would they be?
Man, that is tough. Okay. Let's do, how about Theodore Roosevelt, father of conservation? Let's do it while he was still president, not before he went kind of crazy. Theodore Roosevelt, while he was president.
That is a first. I'm pretty sure we've never had a Teddy.
A Teddy, man. Yeah, Teddy. You think about where do we fish and why do we fish and hunt and things like that. I mean,
the federal park system, basically.
Public lands. I mean, that all started with Teddy. While he was president, that would be good. And then I'm thinking Johnny Morris. Johnny Morris is, the man does so much for conservation and spends an unbelievable amount. He's donated so much money even in the last year to conservation. So I think he would be good. And I want to say Joe Rogan to moderate the conversation. Yes. We need somebody who can keep us on topic and maybe throw something crazy that we weren't thinking about. How about that?
Yeah, that awesome. Is great. Yeah.
That might be one of the coolest 3 we've had on this show. That's so good.
Teddy, Johnny, and Joe Rogan. Let's have a party, man.
Exactly. Joe will bring the shrooms. That's what Joe would do.
You don't know what Teddy had back in the day.
This is true. This is true.
I mean, I think awesome. That would be interesting.
Yeah, you have to remember that was before recreational drug use was banned. So I'm sure a lot of things went on way back then.
It was legitimately the exploratory stage of America. So yes. Yes.
There you go. That's how we would do it.
That's awesome.
Fantastic.
Well, Steve, for real, dude, just thank you for dropping the knowledge on us and everybody that is watching currently live, but also people that We'll listen to this after the fact on MP3. I think everyone has learned a lot.
Yes.
And I think we're all in agreement. If you're good with it, let's reschedule a part 2 for this thing, get you on more as these topics arise to kind of pick your brain. Someone that's on the front lines of this stuff, that does it day in, day out, and knows the nitty-gritties to an accurate standpoint, where us anglers, us simple-minded folk up here, are just kind of have like what we see, our perception, days in the water, where you actually know the facts. So if you're cool with it, man, we're going to keep getting you on the show to talk about this stuff.
I'm cool with it, but I'm just an angler, just like you guys. I just get paid to think about it.
Perfect. Well, for real, thank you for joining us tonight. It was a lot of fun, and looking forward to getting you on again here soon.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Yeah. Have a good night. Good luck tomorrow.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right, Steve. We'll be in touch.
Bye, guys.
Yeah.
See ya. That was awesome.
I have so many smallmouth questions we didn't even get to.
That's why we need a part 2, part 3, part 10, part 50. Yeah, I have a feeling schedule permitting, we're gonna have Steve on quite a few times on this show moving forward.
I also want to give a shout out to everyone who tuned in and asked
Yeah.
all these awesome questions. You guys rocked. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Heck
Yes.
yeah. Appreciate everyone as always joining in. It's nice, Andy, to get back. You're feeling well. We're firing on all cylinders
Yeah.
now. It's been a hectic fall of travel and missed shows. And we appreciate everybody that's stuck it out through thick and thin with this show. Kind of Andy's been taking the reins when I've been gone, and obviously
And Bailey's been solo because I've been sick for a month. So
Yeah.
it's been a wild ride.
Regardless, we appreciate all of you guys that tune into the show, whether it's you're tuning on YouTube, Facebook, or MP3. We appreciate it. If you guys do, a considerable amount of our folks listen to this show on Spotify as well as Apple Podcasts. If you guys could, if you get 2 seconds while you're listening to the show, give us a rating and review on MP3 on those two platforms, especially. It really helps us out. We'd really appreciate it. Helps us get more views in terms of finding new folks, more people that search fishing or bass fishing that want to learn more about it. They're able to see our shows and able to learn from folks like Steve that we had on tonight and spread more of this education that needs to be known about in our sports. The more you guys can do that, helps us, helps Steve, helps you guys in the long run, and helps our sport. So it's a full cycle. So we appreciate it if you could do so.
I'm going to toss this out there too. Is just like, if you guys absolutely love this show, please share it with your friends. Like, help us grow so we can continue to bring all of you awesome content.
Exactly. A lot of great folks. Brad's still here too, and Brad, again, congrats on the deletes.
Yeah.
We'll be in touch, buddy.
Yeah.
But as always, folks, appreciate you guys. Apparel is coming very soon. I promise, within the next couple of weeks. So hopefully we have that for you guys, so you guys can reap the rewards of getting some Serious Angler merch. And again, if you've not checked out the new show on Serious Angler Podcast, it's been around. It's almost full 2 months now that Lure Lab has been up and running. Andy's been pumping away on content for that. Posts every Saturday morning. So for folks that still have open water while you're driving to the ramp, great show to binge. Topics of techniques, hot baits, etc. And he's doing a great job. All of that is linked down below if you guys want to go listen and watch on the Lure Lab, which is a new show on the Serious Angler Podcast Network. But Andy, anything else the folks need to know before we tune out tonight?
See ya. We are good.
I will say, Friday's episode for Serious Angler is going to be a fun one. We're getting a good friend of ours on who's a kayak angler, Mr. Matthew Scotch, who had a great showing at the Hobie TOC that I was at, where I sucked. He did great. He would have done way better on the final day, except for a crazy story that led to him fishing butt naked the whole day.
Yikes.
We're going to dive into that story. It's going to be pretty interesting. So make sure you guys stay tuned for Friday. That's going to be a fun one. But as always, folks, appreciate you guys. We will see you on Friday.